We've reviewed how to find subjects and verbs in simple sentences. As soon as sentences get more complicated and involve numerous subjects and verbs, we need to start using the word clause. The word clause simply means a subject and a verb working together. And sentences are made of clauses, often many clauses. You can build complex sentences with a series of clauses. And to understand how those work together and to make sure you're using clauses correctly, it's really crucial to distinguish between two basic kinds of clauses. There is an independent clause, the independent clause, sometimes called the main clause, and the dependent clause, sometimes called the subordinate clause. I'm going to use the words that are in yellow, independent and dependent clause. Okay, so what's the distinction? Well, it's a fairly simple one. An independent clause sounds like a complete thought, expresses a complete thought, and if you wish, that thought could stand by itself as a sentence. So an independent clause has the ability to be a sentence. In my example here, we decided to walk home. I've written it with no punctuation because I could make this part of a larger sentence if I wanted to. But because it's an independent clause with a subject here and a verb here, because it's an independent clause, I could, if I wanted to, make it a sentence by itself. So I could capitalize it here, capitalize the W, put a period at the end, and suddenly I have a sentence. We decided to walk home. So an independent clause has that capacity to stand alone as a sentence if you wish to use it that way. All right. The other kind of clause is the dependent clause, and there are many subcategories of dependent clauses, and I'm going to show you some of them. But the important word to remember is dependent clause. A dependent clause can't do this. It can't be a sentence by itself. So here I have a clause with a subject, it, and I have a verb, was pouring. So I have a subject-verb construction, it was pouring rain. But I have started the clause with these two words, even though. And as a result, my thought, even though it was pouring rain, sounds incomplete. And it sounds incomplete because the words even though are requiring me to connect this thought to some other thought, some other clause. And obviously what a dependent clause has to be connected to is an independent clause. So in my example, we decided to walk home is the independent clause. I could connect that to this dependent clause like so. We decided to walk home even though it was pouring rain. Or I could say, even though it was pouring rain, we decided to walk home. And that way the dependent clause would be functioning within a complete sentence because it has become attached to an independent clause. So the basic idea here is that to have a complete sentence you need an independent clause. You can attach one or more dependent clauses to that independent clause. You can string together a whole series of clauses, some of them dependent and some of them perhaps independent, but the most important thing is every time you have a sentence, somewhere in there you need to have the first kind of clause here, the independent clause. It has to be in there somewhere. All right. The problematic part of all of this is the second one here. This stuff here, the dependent clause, is the stuff that's tricky. So I'm going to walk you through some of the basic kinds of dependent clauses. It's important to be able to know when you are using them or when you're reading them. So let's go to the next slide. We have here something called the adverbial clause. The term adverbial clause isn't that important to me. It's just a category of dependent clause. You don't have to memorize all of this. But what I'd like you to be able to do is recognize when you've got this kind of clause. So the words that you see in yellow are words that commonly begin a clause kind. So when you have words like after, if, unless, so that, because, since, although, while, as though, okay, you see a whole series of them here. When you have words like this, you've got an adverbial clause, and an adverbial clause is a kind of dependent clause. There are more words that create these sorts of clauses, but I've just included some of the more common ones. Okay. Another kind of dependent clause is called a relative clause. A relative clause often begins with one of these words in yellow, words like that, which, who, whom, whose, when, where, why. It doesn't always begin like this, but these are commonly the words that can be used to create relative clauses. And relative clauses are the words in red. Okay, so you see, here's a relative clause, here's another one. All of these red words are relative clauses. And what are they doing? They are giving you information about a word that has come immediately before them. So when I say the woman whom I love has left the country, I'm telling you something about the woman. When I say I found the tool that I needed, I'm telling you something about the tool. Which is gold-plated is telling you something about the trophy. Okay, so relative clauses always indicate something about a word or words preceding them, and in many cases you can feel or hear how these words, these clauses, all these words in red here, would not sound complete if we didn't put them in the sentence that we find them in. So for example, if I simply use the words that I needed, or which is gold-plated, or who had spoken, or to whom I referred, if I use these words without everything else, I would have an incomplete thought. I would have an incomplete sentence. Okay, my final example of a dependent clause is something called a noun clause. This is created with the words that you see in yellow: what, where, whatever, whoever, whichever. And the noun clause simply is a group of words that functions just like a noun would function in a sentence. So when I take the word what and I use a subject and a verb, what I is the subject, need is the verb. When I say what I need, I'm talking about a thing. Okay, I'm talking about something that I need, and I'm making this construction, what I need, function like a noun in my sentence. So what I need is a stiff drink. I could easily say something like this is a stiff drink, or it is a stiff drink, or whiskey is a stiff drink. But in this case I'm using this construction, what I need, to express the idea. Okay, same thing for everything else you see here. All the words in red give us a subject-verb construction functioning very much like a noun would function in a sentence. And that's my final example. In all of these cases, what I've shown you in the constructions that are called dependent clauses is I've shown you constructions that can't be sentences by themselves. They have to be connected to a larger thought, another clause, and that clause is the independent clause. All right, that's it. Thanks.